When it comes to opposing the American intervention in Vietnam, one of the most common arguments given is that, simply put, the Vietnamese people generally supported communism, with little to no one actually supporting the anti communist government in the South. To defend this assertion, one of the most commonly used quotes, and perhaps the most commonly used quote, is Eisenhower's remarks in his memoirs. More specifically, I am referring to Eisenhower's Mandate for Change, which he discusses the first 4 years of his presidency from 1953 to 1957. The portional quote is the following: I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader. Dwight D. Eisenhower, A Mandate for Change. Now, for the sake of privacy, I will not be sharing screenshots of individuals or organizations who have used the Eisenhower passage to support their criticisms of the American intervention in Vietnam. However, if one does examine sources or perspectives that are critical of it, it is not uncommon to come across this quoting of the Eisenhower passage. After all, it comes from the literal President of the United States, and it demonstrably proves that little to no one supported the government that America went to war for, right? There is, of course, just one problem with this partial quoting, and it has to do with the fact that it is a partial quote. The full quote is quite different, and it is the following: I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader rather than Chief of State Bao Dai. Indeed, the lack of leadership and drive on the part of Bao Dai was a factor in the feeling prevalent among Vietnamese that they had nothing to fight for. So, the first aspect of this full quote that must be mentioned is the fact that it mentions Bao Dai specifically. Now, this part is very important because the partial quote gives the impression that Eisenhower is commenting about Ho Chi Minh's overall popularity level, when it is actually comparing Ho Chi Minh to Bao Dai, which is also especially noteworthy because by 1954, Bao Dai was not very popular. While he did initially enjoy some love because he responded relatively well to the August Revolution in 1945 and had helped establish the state of Vietnam in 1949, thereby giving him more appeal among nationalists who wanted eventual independence but did not support communism, much of this goodwill evaporated due to the continuation of the French war to recolonize Vietnam, making these nationalists believe that they would never reach independence under his rule. Hence, by 1954, he was no longer seen as someone akin to Duy Tân, Tan Thai, or Ham Nghe, all of whom were Nguyen emperors who were beloved for resisting the French, but instead as a tool and puppet of the French. Furthermore, Eisenhower notes that he was considering a hypothetical election that would have been held as of the time of the fighting, referring to the First Indochina War. Let us be generous as possible and choose 1954, which is the closest year to 1956, which is when the hypothetical Geneva Accords elections would have been held. The issue with making a claim about the 1956 elections using a quote about the 1954 elections is that what was true leading up to 1954 was not necessarily true in 1956. Explain why. If we examine Ngô Đình Diệm, who most likely would have been the opponent to Ho Chi Minh in a hypothetical election in 1956, he was arguably at the peak of his popularity during this time. Indeed, he had just secured victory over the Binh Xuyen criminal syndicate, who had dominated Saigon for more than a decade, and he had rallied many other nationalist and religious groups beforehand to help him do so. Furthermore, he had ousted the unpopular Bao Dai in a popular, albeit rigged, referendum, as well as pro-French officers such as Nguyen Quang Hin. And lastly, he had facilitated Operation Passage of Freedom, which gave some the impression that he had rescued hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese from evil communism in the north, which is a loaded description, of course, but that is how some perceive the situation to be. Meanwhile, if we examine Ho Chi Minh's popularity, one can see that it was actually at a low point due to the controversy associated with his land reform program. Now, there were a couple of reasons for this, but one major reason was that the majority of individuals killed were not even landlords. Indeed, most of these people were simply individuals that others had quarrels or disputes with, and those people reported them to the local authorities or whatever mob was in the area, and they often died horrible deaths. In fact, There was even an incident called the Lu Uprising in Nghệ An province, which is notable for a couple of reasons. One, it is arguably the only example of a major rebellion happening under North Vietnamese rule, and two, it occurred in Ho Chi Minh's home province, which should demonstrate the extent to which people were angry with these programs. And Ho Chi Minh himself was aware of this, and he had to tearfully apologize to the public along with other North Vietnamese leaders such as Bao Nguyen Giap. Indeed, even the Pentagon Papers, which are commonly used to criticize the American intervention in Vietnam, admit that Ngo Dinh Diem would have done much better than Bao Dai by 1956, simply because Ngo Dinh Diem in 1956 would have been a much better candidate in a much more different environment than Bao Dai during the second half of the First Indochina War. And even during the 1960s, so in the years after Eisenhower's memoirs were published, the publisher even had to clarify to the public that the selective quoting of the passage was misleading. In conclusion, I would actually like to point out that I would still bet on a Ho Chi Minh victory in 1956, given his reputation as a nationalist who fought against the French and Japanese. It just would not be as certain as the selective quoting of the Eisenhower passage suggests. Indeed, figuring out how many people supported Ho Chi Minh is a valid question and inquiry that should be researched historians to the best possible extent. That being said, there are current issues such as the lack of survey data that we have about how Vietnamese people actually felt, with the best we have really being only journalist estimates and intelligence estimates, which aren't as precise and far-reaching as an actual survey. And there is the question of whether such support would be free or coerced, especially considering the purge of other nationalist groups by the Viet Minh and also Ngo Dinh Diem as well, which could be ideas for a future video. So for my last point, I would like to emphasize the importance of recognizing specificity of time, place, and people. Indeed, we have seen how this quote, once you've seen the full quote and not the partial quote, makes a specific claim about a certain time period, a certain place, and a certain people, which cannot be generalized outside those bounds. Hence, it is so important to not only have the full quote and not a partial quote, but to also contextualize the situation and understand the circumstances, the backgrounds of the factors involved, in order to understand that one cannot really generalize outside those bounds, such as making the claim that, oh, if 80% of people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh instead of Bao Dai, then the same number of people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh instead of Ngo Dinh Diem, which is not correct. I appreciate you for watching to the end of the video. I have a list of sources down in the description if you were curious about further reading, and I'll definitely hear out any feedback that you have regarding this video. Thank you.